Perfect. Awesome. Well, good morning. I guess not really morning anymore, but early afternoon, everyone. For those of you who might not know me, I'm Nicole. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator with People and Pollinators Action Network. We're a nonprofit organization formed in 2014 that focuses on education and outreach, legislative action, and community mobilization to tackle key environmental problems threatening the health and well-being of people and pollinators alike. Sure. Hang on. Okay. So today we'll be hearing from Andrea Montoya, who's a gardener, community activist, and educator who's done a lot of work around pollinator health. Notably, she led the Pollinator Pathway Project in Boulder's historic Goss Grove neighborhood and was key to the development of Boulder's Pollinator Advocate Training Program as well. In this webinar, we'll be learning about how to prepare your garden to best serve pollinator needs during the winter season. Andrea is going to take us through insect habitat preferences, the importance of particular host plants, and other ways that we can maintain our outdoor spaces for a pollinator-friendly winter. And really quick before we jump into things, I want to briefly mention a couple of events we have coming up. Firstly, we have 3 native seed swap events happening this month, with the first one in Denver on October 15th, so this weekend actually. The second in Colorado Springs on October 22nd, and the third in Fort Collins on October 29th. So all throughout the month, lots of opportunities to join around the state. And all of these will run from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Secondly, we have the annual Colorado Pollinator Summit coming up pretty soon here on November 9th. It's going to be at the Denver Botanic Gardens. It's going to be a super informative, inspiring event with multiple expert panels and a keynote speaker, all discussing how we can collaborate to move the needle on pollinator conservation in the coming years. So if you're interested in any of those events, other fun things we have coming up, or just want to stay informed and involved in our goings-ons, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and sign up for our monthly e-news through our website. All of that information is on the slide here. And finally, if you have any questions during the webinar today, please just post them in the chat. Don't feel like you have to unmute or anything. I will help moderate all of those at the end with whatever we have time for. And with that, I will turn it over to Andrea.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you. I'll share my screen more formally in a second. I really appreciate your attendance, and I hope that my talk meets your expectations. I will leave room at the end for questions. So let me know what you think, and save your comments too, because a lot of you here today are experienced and have something to add to this conversation. It's not just about what I'm presenting, but it's about what we know collectively. So let me get my slides shared and we'll start our talk. Can you see everything, Nicole?
Yep, looking great.
Shared correctly. All right, so let me just move this out of the way. This talk is really focused on fall and winter care of our habitat. I will go over about nesting sites and the importance of what happens in our gardens in terms of our pollinators. And I'm also going to extend the talk to something a little broader, something we may not think about very much. And that is what we do in our gardens. What is what we do in our gardens and in these urban habitats? How does it affect the environment? How does it affect the climate, particularly climate change? We may not be thinking about that enough. And so I want to introduce that as an additional subject today. I have to say that there's something we all need to be really prepared for in terms of where garden care and urban habitat care is going. And that is the threat of wildfires. Urban municipalities around the country are now taking a close look at what is happening in landscaping around our homes and in our gardens. I think it's going to be really complicated. I think the discussions are going to be difficult and tough, because some of the stuff we love to grow, they may recommend that we don't grow. Other stuff they're going to want us to grow more of, like maybe chamiso or rabbit brush. It's complicated. I'm not an expert on it, but it does deserve some attention. So I've put here this website address. Take a screenshot and go there and take a look at the recommendations that CSU is making regarding combustible plants around your habitat. So due to climate change and global heating, it's my opinion that we are now bound to begin thinking about not just how we tend to our habitat, but how is what we are doing to our habitat affecting the climate. And I'm going to go into a little bit of a deeper dive in that later in the talk. Remember, domestic urban gardens constitute an important part of the green infrastructure across the country and even across the globe. What we do in our urban gardens has a big impact on our environment and our ecosystems, not only in terms of what we're growing, what we're putting down, what pollinators we're supporting, and what other insects as well. In terms of what we do in our urban spaces, we like to look to our natural spaces, but it's complicated. Our urban spaces, no matter what we do to them, they are bound by a certain amount of land space that we can plant in. It even turns out that there is a finite number of species, and within those species, numbers within those individuals within those species that our individual spaces can support. That's also true for the plants we grow. We have rich soils, and plants will come in there and be opportunistic and take advantage of that soil. So even though we would love to look to nature and should look to nature for how we're managing our habitat, I'm learning by watching others, my own garden, by reading, that we do have to put a certain amount of input into our own urban habitats to keep them in some semblance of balance. These are the olden days, right? Few plants, ornamental, nice, tidy, middle of a space, lots and lots of mulch. Nobody cared where the plants, where the mulch, where anything came from. You did it just kind of to look pretty. This is a little bit more what we have now. A little bit more wild, more diversity, more biodiversity. The beautiful thing about building our native habitats in urban spaces is that we will tend towards much greater biodiversity. When we have a biodiversity of plants, we have a biodiversity of insects, but we also have something else. In addition, we have a biodiversity of microorganisms below the soil. Did you know that when you plant and maintain a native habitat, you have something as much as 1,500 times more native soil organisms as well. So it's a above the ground and below the ground improvement, big improvement. So when looking at our basic needs in urban settings, here's a list of some of the stuff we think about. And I'm going to pose the question, how does what we choose to do affect our ecosystems, affect our climate? So let's talk first about the fact that we have forbs, and our forbs are newly planted, and we have our established forbs, and they each take a little bit of different care. So lots of us, including me, I really like planting in the fall. It gives the forbs a good chance to establish their root systems. It's cooler, it's a little less stressful for them. And you have to remember when you put these forbs in the ground, just as an aside, be sure to knock the soil away. Try to do kind of some bare rooting. Otherwise, you're going to end up with that little rectangular plug left in the ground that creates a barrier between the plug and the soil itself. So knock the soil away and put the soil in and put the plant in. There's a few things to remember when we're doing that, and that is take a look at the ground around you. And I'll show you why in a second. Remember that when you put in your new forbs in the fall, that they require watering to help the roots establish. Water at the base of the plant initially, and continue watering as needed until the temperatures start to cool. You do that by checking the soil with a probe. You can use a thin screwdriver. You can use your hori if you go in lightly, or a stick, and you need to go down a few inches. If the soil's wet, the plant looks like it's tolerating the being in its new place pretty well, you're good. If it's starting to look a little dry and the soil's getting dry, go ahead and water in the fall. They may require a little bit of water throughout the winter. It's very hard to know what our new plant care rules are going to be throughout the drought that we're now experiencing. Please apply mulch around all plantings. We're going to go into more detail about that in a little bit. Leaving established plant stems in place is something we're going to talk about in terms of habitat, but it's also really good to leave them in place because it protects the plant. So taking away those structures prematurely puts the plant in a weakened state to be able to defend itself. There again, we look to nature. Nobody goes up in nature and cuts down stems, right? They stay in place. In particular, sages and agastache perform really well when their stems are left in place, but actually I think all of our plants do. Here's something to remember when you plant, whether you are planting in the spring, the fall, early summer, plant keystone species. I can't recommend it highly enough. If you look to the National Wildlife Foundation, nwf.org, you can see their ecoregions map. Boulder is in ecoregion 6 and 9. That means we have a very unique niche across the country. We have really an admirable niche. So plants, according to the recommendations there, keystone plants are native plants that are critical to the food web and necessary for many life species to complete their life cycle. They are host plants that feed the young caterpillars of approximately 90% of butterflies and moths, the Lepidoptera. Plants that feed specialist bees who only eat pollen from specific plants, and keystone plants for native bees feed both specialist and generalist bees. Can't say enough about them. And remember, we have keystone grasses, forbs, shrubs, and trees. Take a look at the list if you haven't already. So what to watch for when you're planting in the fall? First of all, never till, right? You've been working on building this beautiful soil that is beginning to sequester itself and build itself in this incredible layer of microbes and fungi and organic matter. If you go in there and you till in and you break it up and you disrupt it, not only are you breaking up layers of carbon and releasing carbon into the atmosphere, you're breaking up a very important structure for the plants to thrive. Ground nesting bees, round nesting hole, and they nest in round nesting holes, nest of the ground. For example, near spaces where hard surfaces meet the mud. So like sometimes where the sidewalk is, or if you have a brick wall, you'll find them there. Look among sticks and yard cuttings, look under stones, and look in dead wood. And remember, moths and bees may be found at the bases of plants, all the plants, and particularly the grasses at the base of your chamisa, which is rabbit brush. So be really conscientious. I was planting the other day and I picked up a small flagstone, maybe 8 by 5 inches, and there were several bee nesting holes in there, ground nesting bees in there. And I even got stung for the first time ever by a native bee. It was very mild. It was almost just a sweet nip, but I was so surprised to find them there. So be cautious and be mindful when you're doing fall planting, looking for those pollinator habitat nests. Here's, for those of you who don't know, I know many of you are so experienced, so pardon any repeat pictures you might be seeing from other slideshows. This is an area of undisturbed soil that shows a ground nesting hole of a bee. It's pretty small. They can be really tiny to, quarter of a centimeter. Here's the distinctive backfill around a native bee hole that you might see. Some people think it's a termite nest, and it could be if it's in wood, but if it's in the ground, it's typically a nesting ground bee. Don't forget, the base of the stems is a great place for resting and nesting. You might find actual larvae there. You'll find them along the stems, in the leaves, and we'll get to that a little bit more in a bit. The point is, if you're going to transplant one of your native clump grasses because you want it somewhere else for some reason, whether it be aesthetic or because you want to change something in your habitat, be mindful. There's probably something nesting somewhere along those in that clump. So now we're going to talk about the functions of living herbaceous plant stems. Pretty obvious, nothing groundbreaking here. They support the plant, they transplant nutrients, they store nutrients, and they produce living tissue, and that's how the plant grows. Dead stems are a little different. They're dead, so they're not living anymore. And that is the stem that the insects choose, that the bees choose to live in. They won't go into the living stems. They will only use the dead stems, which makes sense in terms of evolution, right? We don't want, it wouldn't make sense for bees to go in and kill living plants to make a home. The stems, and so like I say, the stems must be dead to provide habitat and nesting for the bees. So I'd like to go specifically into exactly how this is done, and here's why. So I've been doing this work for a little bit now, and every year come around May, April, May, people start going on to Nextdoor, you know, that community site. And they say, I can't stand looking at this stubble anymore. When can I cut it down? And then a zillion opinions come up. And inevitably people say, wait till the end of June. Well, oops. It turns out it's a much longer commitment than that. It's actually it's like a 3-year commitment. So let's talk a little bit what is known about the actual findings about how bees nest in stems. And this work comes out of Tufts University from their native bee lab. I really like their work. It's a pretty interesting paper. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the stems. This is not an exhaustive list. Our native smooth sumac, the small carpenter bees use that. We've got elderberry and box elders, great flower stems, Agassica, echinacea, sunflowers, Liatris monardus, solidago, and asters. These are some of my favorite. And notice these are also keystone species. It's not an exhaustive list, though. You can find a pretty exhaustive list on Xerces very easily on the internet. So here is the actual rules for leaving stems. It's a 3-year commitment. Year 1, the stems with soft, pithy centers grow, and the bees won't go in there like we just talked about. In December or so, you cut those stems back to about 6 to 18 inches. And don't forget, use stems of varying widths and diameters. And don't cut all the stems back or you're going to lose bird seed. You're going to lose seed heads for the birds, but you cut some of them back. In year 2, bees actively searching in the late spring and through the summer and early fall will use these stems that you cut back in year 1, and they'll put their larvae in the nest compartments that they create. They'll go in there and many of them will overwinter with their larvae. Now, the next year, which is really year 3, right, from the original stem that grew, is when they'll hatch or mature, pupate. So in year 3, stems produced in year 1, stay with me, will still contain bees. Continue to leave them in place because not all the larvae pupate at once. New stems and year 2 stems do not yet contain larvae because they are still growing. They're still green and growing. Remember also, all bees do not become active at the same time. Some will mature in the spring, others in the fall. During this time, the new bees will start nesting in the stems left from last year's growth. So it is a cyclical rhythm. It is a cyclical conscientious attempt to keep habitat for the bees. So a lot of people say, well, what's going to happen to that stubble? I'm convinced it's going to keep the plant from growing and being healthy. Well, it turns out it actually is better for the plant to grow around these old stems. First of all, the stems decay and add organic matter and nutrients back into the soil. Second of all, a lot of our plants that get kind of floppy wouldn't get so floppy if we left their old stems in place. They'd grow perfectly well. They'd have something to lean up against. And then we wouldn't have to be so concerned with, my New England aster are, all falling over. My Monarda are all falling over. Leave those stems in place. And if you can stand it, just always leave them there. And I'd love to hear what you all have to say about any of this, as we get to the end for questions. Okay, that was Forbes. Don't forget that trees and shrubs are habitat. And we too often forget that in nature, something called succession, the way the earth populates itself with plants, is it goes from low growing mosses and so forth. And eventually the ultimate goal is to grow trees and shrubs. And these trees and shrubs are incredible host plants for hundreds of species, hundreds of insect species that are pollinators and non-pollinators, not to mention habitat for birds. Some people say, if you can't grow anything else, and I'm in this camp, if you can't grow anything else, grow shrubs, plant good trees, take good care of them, keep them alive. If it means you don't have enough sun to grow some flowers, find another place to grow some forbs, maybe a community park, maybe out in the strip next to the street. But if all you can really support are trees and shrubs, they are proven to be better habitat for our invertebrates, and like I said, for our birds, than any of the forbs or grasses we can grow. And not to mention, there are lots of grasses and shrubs that grow under trees. Just take a look out in nature and you'll see what I mean. What to do with flower heads is a big question. I think what happens with flower heads in nature and what happens in an urban setting are a little bit different. The reason being, in a confined urban space, it has to be somewhat controlled. You will seriously end up with such an overgrowth of helianthus and Nepeta. You have to get Nepeta doesn't necessarily do the seed head, but the asters, the sunflowers, you really do have to go through and kind of thin those out. You can put them in small pots and bring them to plant exchanges. Get the seeds though, and take them to plant exchanges or compost them, because you have to keep your blossoms blooming across all seasons. And if you end up with nothing but aster in your yard, though it will do a great service in August and September, October, you're still missing a whole bunch of months there where you won't have any pollen or nectar for the pollinating insects. You will be deadheading to create nesting stems. So remember to save those seeds, and you can use them in winter sow bags. You can keep them and you can direct plant them at the time of cutting them down when they're dry, or you can save them till winter and even do some winter planting. That's a different talk. Remember that in the fall and the winter, in order to support habitat that is healthy in the other seasons for our pollinators, you're going to have to water. They need water. And we're now in a drought. So there's lots of discussions now. There are some authors who say, I'm never going to water. The plants that die are the plants that die. There are other authors, and there are studies that show that the more water the plants get, particularly during the growing season, the more pollen they produce and the more insects they can support. So you're going to have to figure out where you lie in this spectrum, but keep your eyes open because it's an important subject. We just can't know exactly what's going to happen with this intense drought. A lot of people complained this year. They said, my garden just didn't do well. It was so dry, then it was so cold. So how are we going to mitigate this? How to care for shrubs in the winter months is important. Take screenshots if you need to. You can find this. What I have here is our modified instructions from the CSU Extension Services. They're fantastic for giving all these instructions. You've got them here. You water your trees and shrubs and perennials during dry fall and winter periods to prevent root damage that affects the health of the entire plant. Watering protects root systems from freeze-thaw issues, and in addition to preventing the plant from becoming too dry and freezing in the ground, about the ground area. What will happen is the plant will still grow in the spring, and you'll say, see, I didn't water and my plant still grew, and then it just kind of poops out. It never really flowers and it dies. It was still living off of the dormant tissue, and when the dormant tissue revived, that's all the plant had, because it didn't have a root system. The root system may have just completely dried out during the drought. Water only when air and soil temperatures are above 40 degrees. So how do you water trees? I hope that's my next slide. Oh, how much water to use? These are, somehow I didn't make it on this slide, but this is how you water your trees and shrubs. These are the instructions. I don't need to read them to you. Please feel free to take a screenshot. How do you measure watering for trees and shrubs? So if we go back and we say, okay, 5 gallons 2 times per month, or the likelihood that you're going to take out a gallon pail and fill it up, 5 of them, so on and so forth. So there's a couple of ways you can do it. One, a friend of mine uses her, she has a water meter on her spigot. I actually bought one this year. I haven't put it on yet. It's about $30. You can get them at McGuckin's. Then there's a bucket flow method. It's a little more tedious, but what you do is you take your spigot and you turn it on to a really low flow, and you fill up however many buckets you need, and just time how long it took you to fill them at that particular visual flow. You're looking at it, you memorize kind of what the flow looks like. If it takes 3 buckets worth, you notice it took you 10 minutes, and then you just put that particular flow directly onto the base of the plant when you water in the winter. It's kind of complicated to describe if you're not here for an example, but you can ask me about it later if you need to. So I'm going to repeat, because now I'm going to start jumping into climate effects of what we do in our garden. What we do in our urban gardens, and even in our wild urban interfacing gardens, has a big impact on our environment and ecosystems. And I feel that we are absolutely bound to be thinking about these things now. Gone are the days when we just go out and buy and use and apply what we need, what we like, what we prefer, what we read about. We have to, in my opinion, take it a step deeper. Let's talk about the functions and types of mulch for a second. We know why we use mulch, but there might be some newcomers here who don't completely understand. So we use it to protect from dry heat and evaporative loss and root protection. Mainly, that's why we use mulch. However, it does protect against the frosting and melting upheaval that happens that happens to the grounds over the cold months. It's a soil temperature moderator. It keeps it cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. Then there's different types of mulch. And we're not going to go in great detail over every single mulch, but I'll try to hit the most popular ones. And we're mostly talking about our native perennial gardens, but I will throw in a few things about vegetable gardens, particularly if there are questions at the end. I'm not a vegetable gardener, but I've learned some things along the way. And I bet there are vegetable gardeners in the group who could help answer. So here's the different kind of mulches that we have. Let me just go back there so you can take a quick look. I don't feel like it's really necessary to go over all of them. You can see what they are. So let's take a look at it this way. Where does the mulch that we're using, where does it originate? Does it have a carbon footprint? The answer is, spoiler alert, it all does. But how big is the carbon footprint? And what is the combustibility of the material we're talking about using? We're going to have to start answering those questions more and more. It makes me a little uncomfortable because there are certain mulches that are recommended in terms of fire prevention and fire hazard, and I don't like them, the mulches that they're recommending. So it's going to create a conundrum for many of us. Let's look first at a really popular mulch in our state: pebbles, squeegee, and not so much big rock, but mostly pebbles and squeegee. So sand and gravel typically, well, exclusively, they're mined in moist or wet conditions by open pit excavation or by dredging. Open pit excavation is carried out with power shovels, drag lines, front end loaders, and bucket wheel excavators. In rare situations, light charge blasting is done to loosen the deposit. So the pebbles that we buy, that we say, oh, should I get large pebbles or small pebbles? Smooth pebbles or pointy pebbles? That's really not the question. I mean, it's part of your equation. But to me, the question that we owe to our climate, to our earth right now, is to ask a broader question. Pebbles and squeegee are damaging to our environment, just period. Dredging impacts marine organisms negatively through entrainment, habitat degradation, noise, remobilization of contaminants, sedimentation, and increases in suspended sediment concentrations. This is from a really good article published in 2014 in the Journal of Marine Sciences. Here is a picture of dredging. So this river, look what has happened so that we can have pebbles in our garden. This is so hidden from us. And I just really don't think when I go to Lee Hill Peak and I try to decide what kind of gravel I want to put in my garden, spoiler alert, I'm not using gravel in my driveway anymore, pardon me, but this is what it looks like. This is a picture of open pit excavation. So this is all for gravel, and it's horrifying to look at. So pebbles and rock have very high carbon footprint for both production and for transport. To repeat, they destroy water ecosystems and water wildlife. They do perform really well as mulch, but they're not necessary in my opinion. But here's the big thing, they're not combustible. So you're going to hear fire experts say, in the first 30 feet next to your house, you should have nothing but pebbles. How are we going to weigh that out? That's a discussion. I'm not trying to sway the argument here about combustibility. I'm just bringing it up because I know it's going to be more and more important as the months and years go on. So what do forests do? Well, forests use leaves. And you heard me say a little bit ago that everything we do in our gardens produces carbon. And it turns out, I'm just going to check the time to see where we are. Thank you. It turns out that even leaves and other organic matter, as they break down, they produce carbon, and they're 90%. They cause 90% of our climate's carbon dioxide, but it's a very different type. It's very different compared to the intensive amounts that are being caused by humans. And remember, carbon dioxide becomes an elemental carbon that our plants turn it into for photosynthesis. So it is very important. But you might hear this argument. I've heard this argument. I say to people, I'm a big fan of leaving the leaves and using the organic matter. And they say, yeah, but when it breaks down, it produces carbon dioxide. Well, it does. It's true. And it always has. That's why we have an obligation to not add to the situation. Carbon dioxide is a positive thing. Plants need carbon for photosynthesis, but we don't need to be adding to it. Therefore, I'm going to argue that leaves are really good, even though they do break down and produce some carbon. Leaf mulching does not hurt the environment, and it doesn't need to be transported using fossil fuels, and everything else does. It doesn't prevent soil compaction, however. So again, consider, not again, but consider applying a thin layer of wood chip mulch on top of it. So that way, if you do have to step in areas where you are using leaf mulching, you have something to protect against it. It does blow away. Again, consider applying a thin layer of wood chip mulch over the top of it. And you may have to reapply the leaves. As the leaves blow away into an area of your garden, you can either leave them there up against the fence and reapply, or you can put them in bags, paper bags, keep the bags dry, and then reapply the leaves throughout the season. It's more work than using a really thick mulch, bark mulch, and it's more work than using pebbles. But I argue that it is our responsibility to start thinking about the most non-carbon producing ways to do these things. Apply leaves at a depth of 2 to 3 inches. And remember, oak leaves, for those of us who may have a white swamp oak and other oaks, they do form mats. So you might have to break them up a little. You can throw again some fine wood chip mulch in there to keep them so that they don't compact so much. A really popular idea for a long time has been to shred the leaves. And if you shred the leaves, then they break down a little faster. And there's lots of people who do it. It turns out that's not a good thing to do. If you're supporting pollinators and you're supporting, so you're supporting pollinators, not if, you're supporting pollinators. You've spent all this time and energy planting habitat, building habitat. Now, where are all of the chrysalises and larvae? Where are they? Many of them are in the trees. And where in the trees? Well, some of them are on stems, some of them are in the bark. Lots of them, the majority of them, I'd argue, are on the leaves. When these leaves fall to the ground, and here's a picture on the right is a chrysalis, over here is I don't know which insect this is. I'm sure there are very smart people on this website who do, on this webinar, who know. But these are, I believe this was a maple leaf, and I don't remember, but this was also a leaf native to Colorado. Don't crush or mow your leaves. It's been a really popular thing to do. Some people even do it with a gas mower, which is crazy. Lots of people have hand mowers. People have churning mulches, all kinds of things they do to the leaves. If you do that, your leaves will stay in place. Granted, they'll make really good compost, granted, but you will kill a majority of you will kill off a majority of the life cycle that you've worked so hard to create. Xerces and other organizations, and I say, please don't crush or mow your leaves. Leave them whole, use them as they are. Your leaves will want to blow away in the high winds. It's a frustrating problem in Colorado. I've managed that last year by putting down some fine chip mulch, like I said, bagged them up, reapplied them. It was a little more work, but I didn't mind so much having a kind of a chore to do out in the winter and fall. I rather enjoyed it. Bottom line on leaves, leave them whole. Don't carry all those butterflies and bees away to the curb after you've worked so hard to attract them and sustain them. To learn more about this, you can go to Leave the Leaves at Xerces, and they will talk about this in more depth. In fact, the effects of increasing temperatures on leaf degradation is an important topic, since we are introducing global warming and climate change as part of this discussion now. And that is that there's a really good study out of MIT, and it shows that all leaf composition and most organic composition happens at a steady state based when exposed to temperatures. Kind of makes sense, but it's interesting to read about it. And as our temperatures get warmer, these get warmer faster, things are going to break down and nutrients are going to enter the soil at inappropriate times. There's not too much we can do about it, is there? Except keep reapplying mulch, particularly leaf mulch. So how is bark mulch made? That's something we really like to use around here. It's made by mechanically scraping bark off of fallen or cut trees, and it's done by using diesel-powered machinery. So that increases its carbon footprint. Typically, they're dead trees. They're trees that have fallen. They're trees that have been picked up by the Forest Service, and it's typically pine trees in this area. Fine wood and bark mulch. So this is a really busy slide. I'm going to actually go through and read a little bit of it. Fine wood chip mulch can be purchased at Harlequin's, and Lee Hill Pete sells this mulch, although Lee Hill Pete calls it humus, though it's not really humus yet. Humus is the final degradation of compost. It's that very final product. This isn't that. So Harlequin's calls it fine chip mulch, and that's really the better name for it. The benefits of it is that it is local, so it doesn't travel as far as coastal or other tree products like cedar and redwood. It does burn hot, and fire marshals are saying it shouldn't be used within 30 feet of structures. My yard is barely 30 feet long, so, you know, once again, it's going to be a conundrum. Cedar and redwood mulches can be bought at Lee Hill Pete and various big box stores. They have a much higher carbon footprint. They travel a good distance. They don't break down as quickly, as readily as some of the fine wood local chip mulch we have. Gorilla hair is now considered to be an absolute fire hazard, almost more than anything except for pine needles and dry grass. It's right up there. So be really careful. Plus it's probably dyed. It's often dyed, and these dyes enter the soil. I don't know what they do, but since I don't eat dyes, try not to eat dyed food, do I really want to put dyes in my soil? Pine needles are very flammable, and straw is highly flammable and may contain residual pesticides. If at the very end we have time to talk about how to figure out whether your straw has pesticides in it, Michael Bronner has a really good idea about that. We can talk about it at the end. Arborist mulch, also called cob mulch, are wood chips. They're bigger, they're chunkier, and they occur when tree debris is recycled. And that wood can be put through a chipper to create an organic mulch, again, powered by fossil fuel engines. So once again, it has a carbon footprint, and brings us back to the idea of really depending much more heavily on leaves, doesn't it? Because that has, so far of all of them, by far the least carbon footprint. But there's another one that doesn't have a carbon footprint more than degradation. We'll get to that in a minute. These big chunks of these larger chunks, let's say 3 to 5 inches, sometimes even 2 to 3 inches of mulch, work really well around trees and shrubs and along pathways. Remember, when you're mulching with these, which you should be doing for your shrubs and your trees over these cold months, you really want to protect the roots right there up at the surface in particular. Don't bring them too close into the stem of the tree. They should be a good 6 to 8 inches out. It keeps rot and I think also, you know, small mammals from coming into the living bark of the tree. And I put another hint for Michael Bronner in here. If you use these this thick wood mulch as in your walking paths and you've walked on it for a season or two, scrape it aside, and it's pretty cool what's under there. It's this really great compost that you can just push right back into your garden. Please layer this mulch 1 to 3 inches and make sure it's level for walking paths. Here's a great, in my opinion, I guess, along with leaves, it's my favorite way to think about mulching. And that is to intersperse your native habitat with native grasses. Use lots of them. They hold water in the soil. It prevents erosion. When they break down, they add organic matter to the soil. They are fabulous sites for nesting, resting, hiding. I heard a story from Scott Severs, who's the biologist for Longmont. He told me that in the native grasses, in the summer, he sees longhorn bees sleeping along the stems of them in the summer. So they're really important. Grasses provide so much for our systems and ecosystems in our yards and urban spaces. In my opinion, we don't utilize them enough. We go to the store, we want those pretty flowers, we put them in, and then we have over here, here's a grass and there's a grass. And since I'm planting in threes, I'll plant a grass over there. What about 30, right? So I've got tons of grasses in my yard. It serves as an excellent mulch. I never have to do anything to the soil where the flowers are growing next, where the forbs are growing next to the grasses. It's just all really nicely mulched in already. Native grasses need care. So this is just kind of something to memorize or write down or take a screenshot if you don't already know it. Grasses want to be cut back annually at the onset of their active growing season. So cool season grasses want to be cut back in the fall, and warm season grasses in the early spring. Cutting back grasses is best done by hand with shears or mechanically if there are large numbers to be cut. And in our yards, we're not going to have that mechanical situation. But I suppose somebody right next to right next to wild lands might need to do it mechanically. I made for you, and please take a screenshot. These are your cool season grass lists, and I think they're all on there, but then when I counted them at the end, I think there's one missing, but I won't remember which one. But these are cool season grass lists for Colorado. So grab a screenshot of that if you'd like, unless you already have this list. And here's a list of warm season grasses for native to Colorado. These are all so beautiful. They just provide so much for our ecosystems and our climate. And for those who care, they are C4 metabolizers. And then here's non-native grasses that should be replaced with native grasses if you have these. Easier said than done, I'm aware. And of course on here, our non-native grass would be Kentucky bluegrass. I don't know why I didn't put it on there, but I didn't. So do we fertilize in the fall? Well, you should fertilize in the fall, but remember, treat the soil, not the plant. The soil is what's feeding our plants all year long. Use organic fertilizers like the one Michael Bronner makes and sells at Harlequin's. Apply them to shrubs and trees as directed on the package in the fall. Alternatively, you may use a good layer of compost to trees and shrubs when the root systems are typically in the very late fall. Apply near but not on the main stem. You may apply compost to the drip line of your trees if you have a yard that's big enough to tolerate that without you dumping a ton of compost into your garden in the fall. Not the worst thing if you're doing a project that requires it, but probably not needed. And I guess lastly, I would say in terms of fall fertilizing and the care of our plants, just remember, our native plants evolved in meager circumstances. They don't need super rich soils. They don't need tons of amendments. What they need is consistent care. They need some support around invasive and aggressive species that can invade their space because they're all really competitive. But mostly we can enjoy what is there with minimal input in the fall and winter, but not zero. So there's always something to do out there for the better or the worse. I'd like to say, please have a beautiful fall and winter season. Thank you, PPAN. I really appreciate PPAN's ongoing work, everything they do for pollinators, for ecosystems, and they have really been working hard on legal, what's the word I'm looking for, policies around these subjects. So thank you all very, very much, and I'm more than happy to take questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Andrea. That was super informative. I know I learned a ton, especially all that climate stuff and how your garden and the things you do in your garden can impact climate I've never even considered that. So that's awesome. I'm really happy you shared that.
I'm really glad. Yeah. It's come up lately for me this last year. just because people have so many questions around it, and what to use, what's best, what's most beautiful, what's best for this plant or that plant. And I think now at this time, we've just got to get outside of that sort of bubble we've have the grace to be in all these years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any questions today?
Yeah, so we have some accumulating in the chat. Please feel free, everyone, to keep adding your questions in there, and hopefully we have time to get to them. But I'm just going to go through kind of in order that they were left.
Okay.
First question, why should we cut back stems in December? Aren't bees already nested for the winter by then?
So that's a good question. And this is a recorded show. So go back and look at that part of the recording. So remember, that first year when they're still green on the inside, there's nothing nesting in them. The stems you left the year before that, they probably have bees already nesting in them. But let's start with year number 1 and not get confused by before or after. Year number 1, the stems are green. Nothing will nest in a green stem because it'll kill the plant, and they don't want to kill their habitat. When they go dormant, you cut them down. Now you've produced a house for the following spring and summer, when the bees can then enter those tubes where they will nest. And then that's year 2, right? Then in year 3, they will start to come out of there. So you still can't cut them down, the dried ones. So it's a process. It's hard to grasp it the first time you hear it through, but it's in the slideshow, and the slideshow will be published. So go back and take a look at that section.
Perfect. And yes, we will be sharing slides, and we have the recording that will be posted to the PPN YouTube. I saw that Joyce just put that in the chat. So for everyone asking, yes, you will have access to this, don't worry. Next question, we had some comments answering or giving some thoughts on this after, but in case you have any thoughts as well, Andrea, what would anyone suggest about my multi-headed sunflower, which is a native, that has become a jungle, and it is even difficult to go through the gate to the backyard? I feel guilty even thinking to cut them down. So I guess ways to manage that.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about when I was saying there are native spaces and then there are urban spaces. And because our urban spaces have great soil, they have water, we take care, we weed, we do all this stuff, many of the plants are going to be out there just taken over. We look at gardens as these beautiful, peaceful places, but I tell you from an ecological perspective, when you talk to ecologists, they say it's a war out there. Those plants are all trying to fight for their territory, make it their own, and take it over. And they do. Helianthus is particularly aggressive. So what I did with mine is I went ahead and cut them down. I don't want any more seed heads there. Even for mine, I had so many this year, I even took the stems down to about 6 inches already. And then when I went through my garden on my hands and knees, which I'm still laboriously doing, I'm pulling them out, well, cutting them at the bottom, and some of them I'm even pulling out a little bit. You're going to have to manage them just like you're going to have to manage your aster, your nepeta. These are plants that are great for pollinators, but if you let them take over, they are going to make it less viable for your other plants throughout other seasons. Sure. Having said that, Pollinators is considered a keystone species. It's one of our best ones to grow. Just try to grow it in a more contained area. You can't have a yard full of sunflowers or you won't have anything else.
Totally. Great advice. Next question. What do you think of using azomite? I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, as a soil enrichment.
I think there's a time and a place for it. It depends. I wish I could talk to you directly to find out what your main goal is for that. I think some of the soil additives we're using now or amendments we're using, I would encourage you to go back. Where did it come from? How did it get there? What's the footprint? What's the carbon footprint? And what can be used instead? So I wish I could find out exactly why you want to use it, but those would be the steps I would take. And those are the steps I do take when I'm considering what I want to put in my garden soil.
Awesome, thank you. Next question, and yes, folks, if you have to head out, please do. Thank you for being here, but Andrea said that she can stay a little bit longer past the 1 hour mark. So if you guys are interested in hearing the ends of the questions, please do. So next question, would this be a good time to put down mycorrhiza?
So mycorrhiza is fine. There's probably a lot of mycorrhiza already in your soil. And I would caution that unless you have a really specific reason for putting down mycorrhiza, we have to be careful to not get into the head of doing to our soil what we feel like we need to do to our bodies. So we think, okay, we know it's really good to take probiotics and prebiotics, but remember, prebiotics are a way we take care of our body and the soil and the health of our gut. The prebiotic in your garden is the compost. And my guess is there's a whole bunch of mycorrhiza in your soil already. But I will say, if you are planting new plants in a really deprived area, for example, I recently helped someone plant under big rocks, 2 layers of fabric with sand in between. We had to cut through, bring in some more healthy soil with compost. In each of those holes, I put a small amount of mycorrhiza. I put in a little bit of fertilizer. I put in a little bit of fine chip mulch, but that's a very specific situation. Mycorrhiza is expensive too. I'll leave it up to you, but I'm not sure it's necessary. Just 1 minute. Lauren, can you be quiet? I'm sorry, my family's having a riot in the background and I can't hear. Go ahead.
No worries. We did get a little bit of detail context on the azomite question. They said the azomite was recommended to me by a nursery employee to nourish newly planted perennial shrubs like serviceberry.
So I have serviceberry growing in my yard, and I don't know what your exact soil situation there is. So again, find out where azomite comes from. How is it mined? And if you feel like it has a very low carbon footprint, it's not going to hurt, but I don't really think you need it. I'll just be really blunt. I don't think you need it. I have never used it. And I do fertilize with Michael's organic fertilizer that he puts together once a fall around my serviceberry and other shrubs, and knock on wood, but they're doing really well.
Good to know. And last question that we have so far, if people, again, if you have last questions, drop them in the chat. But will pollinators nest in stems that have been cut and left in the garden?
So once you cut a stem, and I think what you're saying is I cut them down and I laid them down on the ground. I think that's what that person is saying. They'll fill up with earwigs. So something will nest in there, but it won't be bees. They really prefer, the bees that use the stems prefer the vertical stems. And if you're going to use horizontal stemming or horizontal tubing in bee boxes, which people aren't really recommending that much anymore for the health of the bees, but if you use them, that's a little bit different story. But no, they won't enter them.
Awesome. And we did get one more question. What about fungal issues with leaving the leaves? I think maybe that's with the mulching stuff that you were talking about.
Yeah, so people always worry about fungal creation of fungi like it's a bad thing. So first of all, it may not be a bad thing, but having said that, I'm not talking about sod. So if you put sod down, if you put leaves on your sod, it'll kill it. Leaves are not very many leaves, maybe 1/2 inch thick is all you're going to need on sod. You know, it's sod. It's not even native to here. But in your garden, if you put leaves about 1 to 3 inches in depth, and if they are not exclusively oak leaves, they're not going to mat down when they get wet, and they're not going to grow the kind of fungi that can put soil out of balance. What I've read and what experts have told me is that it's a really good idea if you can use different kinds of leaves. So you might use some oak leaves along with some silver maple leaves, along with some hackberry leaves, kind of a little potpourri of leaves, so that they don't tend to, because it's that matting and layering where stuff can grow. But 1 to 3 inches of leaves is just really not going to create a fungal problem for native garden habitat soil that I've ever seen.
Totally. Awesome. That makes a lot of sense, actually. And another question, this person said that they have Russian olives that are very popular with the pollinators, but they know that they're invasive. So do you have any opinions on Russian olives as a plant, or maybe alternatives that might be good?
So Russian olives are an invasive species, and they do, like a lot of the invasive species, like let's take sweet pea, for example. The insects love them, the bees love them, and lots of pollinators are attracted to them. The problem comes in when these invasive species are so aggressive and their pollen gets out into the wild, and then they dominate over our native species. And when we start losing our native species, it's not a one-for-one thing. It's not like one insect can use a Russian olive because it has chosen to no longer use a willow or something like that. It's because they are generalists. But all the insects that are specialists that really depend upon those species that are native to our area begin to die out because they're losing their foods in competition to the invasive species. There's a very good list that Darren Davidson put together for the CSU Extension Center called Plant This, Not That. And that list is something I can share with Joyce, and Joyce can put up on PPAN website if she doesn't already have it there. And that list gives you very specific guidelines as to what to grow if you are trying to get rid of invasive species, but still love yellow flowers, for example. Or you want to get rid of invasive species, but you really like the fragrance of it. It will give you some great alternatives.
Awesome. That's really helpful. We do have 2 more questions here. I'm good on time. Okay. I'm going to make the executive decision and say that these will be our last 2, but we will again be sharing these slides and the recording, as well as some additional resources. So hopefully that can help answer any additional questions beyond these 2 as well. But next question, how about the effect of using blowers for leaf cleanup? So like leaf blowers.
So leaf blowers do a lot of really horrible things, even when they're electric. So first of all, let's just pretend it's not even a combustible engine, because these combustible engines that are used on leaf blowers give you more air pollution back into the face, into the environment, than something like 30 trips back and forth to Denver from Boulder. It's pretty intense. It's disgusting. Let's say you're using an electric one. Well, first of all, electricity is created by nuclear power, and nuclear power is not a benign thing, just saying. But let's talk about the actual mechanics of high power winds being used on leaves. It kills the larva, just as though you ran a lawnmower over them or put them through a shredder. It kills them. It in particular destroys the habitat of those species that nest right next in the plants that grow right next to the sidewalk or grow right next to a bricked area or a wall. They really like to get in there and nestle. It's warm, it's got the right drainage. You go by there, whoof, one pass of a leaf blower and they're dead. The nest is gone. And the leaves themselves are broken apart, and the larvae have a very hard time making it under that much velocity.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then last question, suggestions for getting rid of suckering elm trees?
No, I don't have a suggestion for that, but I think those suggestions exist at CSU Extension Center. It's a hard problem. It's kind of like saying, how do I get rid of cheatgrass? But if I come up with the answer, I'll be kind of rich one day.
Perfect.
I know that growing native species and keeping after these plants really makes a difference. We've had a habit of going in and pulling stuff out of the ground. I'm going to dig it up. I'm going to get it out of there. I'm going to get rid of those roots. And it turns out that that's a really bad approach. Anything you can cut off at the ground level, even though it's going to take a lot of years of doing that to keep the roots from being able to keep the above ground plant from photosynthesizing and feeding the roots, anything you can do to keep that root system in place is actually good. The tree itself is invasive, and the roots, the tree itself is invasive. We don't want it here. But what it does in the ground is actually really good for aerating soil, nutrient transfer, movement of water. So it's not all, 1,000% bad.
Oh, good to know. I would have thought the opposite. I would have been in there digging it all up. So that's
we got to stop that stuff. We got to stop saying what's in the soil is an enemy. My motto as of lately, I haven't always had this little piece of wisdom is, if you don't know what to do, just don't do anything. Wait, think about it, read about it, ask other people. Make sure you're doing the right thing before you start disrupting the earth. So thank you all. Thank you, PPAN. Please consider joining our pollinator advocate program that the city is providing, and that I will be one of the co-teachers for this spring and summer, and learn all kinds of stuff for free. Find us on Cool Boulder website.
Sounds good. Thank you again, Andrea. This was amazing. I mean, you can see in the chat, people are had a great time today. And yes, we will be sharing slides and everything. Yeah, thank you all for being here. And I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday and week.
Thanks a million, everybody. Bye.